video, kind of an overview video on one of the best sync programs I've ever used. And it's called Always Sync. It is available in a free trial. You can get a free trial for 30 days. And it's very, very flexible, and it takes syncing files and folders to a whole new level. You've seen several of my videos on syncing data, within your NAS and so on. This allows you to go well beyond those borders, and certainly well beyond configuration and tunability of how you want your data to be moved around. So Always Sync allows you to go across multiple platforms. So it's you can run from PC to PC, PC to NAS, PC to Linux box, PC to a portable device, USB drives. It goes across. It's very, very versatile. And as we go through the interface and configuration, you'll get to see exactly what that means. So today, what I want to cover is the basic setup, configuration, scheduling, talk about portable drives. Some of the key features that are in Always Sync. You can obviously, as we mentioned, go across multiple device types. It's also extremely flexible in terms of bidirectional syncing, so you can decide what direction, how, and what triggers the synchronization. You have a very granular control. It keeps a history, works with any file system, and allows you to actually sync files or folders or both. So why would I use this over something that's built into the NAS? And the primary reason for that is flexibility. With the NAS, you're basically going to and from the NAS itself, more or less on a schedule. This allows you to trigger my multiple events. For example, plugging in a USB drive. To be able to sync up data when you plug in a USB drive is extremely powerful. How about when data changes? When you change a file, add a file, delete a file, you want that synchronization to be triggered automatically. This will allow you to do that. So when would you use one over the other? And the way that I look at it is I use this to basically aggregate data from all of my devices into kind of one location, and then I use the NAS location to copy it to various other locations, including the cloud. But beyond that, I also use it for things like portable devices. It's extremely powerful in that area, and we'll get to that in the setup and configuration and demo of how this thing works. So let me give you a little history about Always Sync for me. They obviously are not paying me or anything to talk about this program. This is something that I've been using probably close to 10 years or so. I was using this back in when Microsoft Home Server used to be a thing, and I used it for aggregating all of my data, and it was extremely powerful then, and it's still very powerful now. They really haven't changed the interface that much. They just keep tuning and adjusting the accuracy, the tunability, adding features to it. But for the most part, the look and feel is almost the same as it was 10 years ago. When you get into how well it works, you'll see that it probably doesn't make much difference. 90% of the time, you're not even looking at the interface because you're actually relying on this thing to work. So with that, let's get started with the actual program, walk through some of the menus. We'll see how this thing's configured and go from there. So for starters, let's talk about these tabs here. So these tabs are actually your individual jobs. You can have multiple jobs, as many as you want, on this program. So, and each one can have, specific configurations or options and what triggers the file synchronization. So we'll go through a couple of examples. I kind of set up a dummy job here just to kind of illustrate how this works, but we'll create a new one. So let's say I want to create a new job. I can do it by right-clicking on any of the tabs and saying new job. I can clone an existing job, so if I do want to use the same configurations, I can do that rather than readjust that particular folder for all of the options that I have, which we'll get into. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll click a new job, and this will create a new job for us here. And as you can see here, there's the to and from location, or the two separate locations, I should say. It's not really even to and from. It's really location 1, location 2, because it will be bidirectional. So the first thing I have here is it says I've got a Windows folder. So I'm going to go ahead and browse Windows, and I'm just going to pick just for the fun of it, I'm going to pick this Intel folder because it's just drivers. And then I'm going to pick alternate or second location. So I'm going to go ahead and let's pick that one, and I'll go down to my test folder and click OK. So what I've got here is basically two locations. And again, don't get twisted up on the direction, because if you look here, the arrow by default will be bidirectional. So this will sync and keep both locations current at all times, which includes deletions, changes. It will propagate those changes and deletions down to each folder. So if you delete in one section, it's going to delete in the others, and that's something you need to be aware of. If you want to change that, you can change that by just clicking change and picking the direction that you want to go. So for example, I might want to just go from this direction. And if I do that, you see the arrow changes. So it's only going to move data from this side from the test folder to the Intel folder. If I want to go the other direction, I simply click on the other arrow. It will reverse the direction. So it will take it from the Intel side down to the test side. If I want to go back to bidirectional, I just go back to the bidirectional tab. One thing I want to draw your attention to is this is critical here. The propagation of deletions and modifications. You got to decide how you want your deleted files to be handled. So if I delete in one folder, do I want it deleted in both? A lot of times you do, and a lot of times you don't. So you have to just make that decision. Same with modifications. If it sees a file change, is it going to update both locations, or is it going to just keep it current? So you have to kind of decide what and how you want to configure your data there. But these are all the options that you have in these particular locations. So I'm going to go back to the default, and I'm going to say, give me everything: bidirectional, propagate deletions, and propagate modifications. So now I've got this job, and if I analyze the job, it's going to do a quick look, and it's going to say, it's warning me that there are more than 50% of the files in one of these folders that's different. And that's just a warning. It's all it is. It's saying that, you know, if you create a new folder and it's empty, of course you're going to get a notification, because it's just telling you that, hey, you've got a bunch of data in one folder and you've got nothing in the other one. Is that really what you want to do? So I can now choose, I can ignore that. I can stop the synchronization, or the analyzing in this case. Or I can also set the default behavior. So if my default behavior is to just ignore, right now it's set to alert by default. So I can set the default behavior to ignore, and it will always ignore these warnings and just go to town. So for now, I'm going to click ignore, but I'm going to also say ignore as the default behavior. And now you can see I've got basically a summary of what's going on. There's 6 new files, 1 file's unchanged, and there's a total of 8 files in here. So this was just to analyze. Now, I could have went straight to synchronize and watched it copy data over, but I wanted to walk you through, you know, the different options. So now I'm going to go ahead and sync, and as you can see, it's already finished because there's not a lot of data in there. So it's basically, it's synchronized these two locations so that they're both are exactly the same. So if I look at the files, and if I go to my Intel file, you can see that I have 2 folders with some data in them. And if I go to my test folders, you'll see I have the same exact data in that folder. So basically, what this has done is actually take these 2 separate locations and make them current. Where this thing really excels and gets a little bit unique is some of the other options. So let's, for example, go to properties. If I right click on my job tab, and I obviously have things like rename job, so I can rename the job to whatever I want, but I also can look at the properties, and this is where it gets a little interesting. So here I have a bunch of stuff I can actually set to this job. And this will probably explain why job cloning comes in handy sometimes. So I can set all of these different things for each job, each sync job. So let's start with the first one. This allows me to set the default characteristics. So it's basically telling me how to handle what rules to use when synchronizing. Things like propagate deletions, propagate modifications, how it handles copying locked files, and any security attributes. And here's an interesting one. Ignore the 1 hour file modification time. So basically anything that sees a file date less than an hour, it's going to ignore it. That's the default configuration. This one here is very powerful. So here I have a tremendous amount of power. For example, if I'm synchronizing to a USB drive, I can set it to where the minute I plug that drive in, data will immediately get synchronized between the two predetermined folders. So I may have a folder on the USB drive and a folder on my computer, and when I plug in the USB device, it's going to automatically sync, get that out of the way, make the files current, and that's almost an automatic backup. Here it allows me to sync to a specified period. So if I pick on this, I can actually select how often or at what increments do I want the backup to take place. Here is when if file changes are detected. So it's going to look and say, hey, I've got a file that changed. I'm going to go ahead and synchronize. So it's going to trigger the sync, and it's going to look for that change and make sure it's in both locations. And again, I can change this to whatever I want. And one of the things that comes in real handy, again, depending on your configuration, will be selecting immediately. So if you want synchronization to take place the minute you make a change, you can do that. Bear in mind that there's some overhead, so you will have to, depending on your system, how large the files you're working, you may want to trim that down to every 5 minutes, 10 minutes or something like that. Immediately we'll monitor the changes, and the minute you save a file, it'll immediately copy it, and that's fine for things like Word files and stuff. But if you're doing editing, if you're doing large files that are, that you save on a regular basis, and it's going to try to copy that whole file every time. So, you got to kind of select which option works best for you. The other option is to just synchronize when the computer's idle. So when it detects you're not using your computer, it'll actually execute the synchronization. And then this one is on application start. So every time you start the application, it'll run through. I don't really like this one too much, but it's there. And then this one here is on before you log off. So when you click on log off, it will actually take you a little bit longer to log off. It'll perform the sync and then log you off. And then this one, which we'll get into more detail later on about how to best use this particular option, is to use the Windows Task Scheduler. So if you click on use this for the task scheduler, what happens is it's going to go ahead and pull open your scheduler, and it's going to create a job already set up for you with all the options set up. And this is fine, again, for a particular folder, but I'm going to show you later how to do the entire thing, which I think is a little bit more powerful. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete this for now and uncheck this box. So again, I just wanted to kind of cover all the options, and this is on a job by job basis. So every tab on this right now can be configured with different options. So each tab can be done differently. One other thing I wanted to mention, let's go back to properties here, is that when you finish configuring all of these, you can set this as your default configuration. So if you kind of like it this way, and you think you're going to use that most of the time, you can set it as your default and then make changes as required. The other option is, as mentioned earlier, is when you have a particular job configured, you can just clone the job, and then what it will do is basically make a copy of that, and then you can just change the folders to different locations. And I just changed the folders. So real quick, I want to just show you a couple of the jobs that I've created, and then we'll get into scheduling this thing so that it works the way you want it to work. So I'm just going to look here at updates, and if you look here, you'll see that I actually have this going from NAS to NAS. And this is just to demonstrate that you're not really limited to putting this just on a PC. You can have a PC control two basically stagnant locations. And these can be USB drives. These can be a shared drive in another system. It can be whatever you want it to be. You're not really limited to what you can do with this thing. So this particular one is set up to copy all of my software update files from one NAS to the other. And again, this particular one I could have done from within the NAS, but in this particular case, having everything centralized in one location for some of these kind of helps me. So you have options. I mean, if you have a NAS, you have some options. If you don't have a NAS, this program, it will save your life. I mean, because it allows you to basically control everything. There's one last thing I want to mention before we get off this screen, because there's a bunch of other hidden things you can do with this thing. And if you notice over here on each one of the locations, it says Windows folder. However, I'm not limited to a Windows folder. If I drop these down, you'll see that I can literally copy to and from or synchronize to and from virtually anything. FTP servers, Amazon S3, I can do a WebDAV, I can do an active sync folder, I can do Google Drive, Windows Azure, OneDrive, Dropbox, Amazon Cloud, Box. You get the idea. There's just a bunch of options here. So you can literally sync local folders to cloud folders if that's what you want to do, and you can do it every which way but loose. You can also take it, if they're going to be synchronized, any changes you make to your cloud drive will also be copied to your system. So again, it's just a few extra options I wanted to cover before we go on to the next step. So if I look at, let's go back to our test job here. And if I look at, I want to talk a little bit about the configuration. When you select your locations, there's a couple other options that are kind of important. So if I pick a specific location, one of the options I have is to bind the drive characteristics. And what that means is, let's say, for example, I'm syncing to a USB drive, and that USB drive may have letter D, or drive letter D, E might change around depending on what else you got plugged into your system. This allows me to skip that whole nonsense. Instead of binding to drive, E or D or whatever it is, it allows me to actually bind to the specifics of the drive. So it will read that drive regardless of the drive letter that's assigned to it, and it will know that's the drive I want. So extremely powerful for portable devices, not super useful for anything else. This is also very powerful. Here you have the option of storing plain files. You can compress the files, meaning you might want to save space in an alternate location and compress it. And the real important one for me is to compress and encrypt. So if you want to copy the files, say from a computer location to a USB drive, for example, the option of compressing and encrypting the files is extremely powerful because, number one, you'll use up less space, and more importantly, the files on the USB, which can be easily lost or brought around, will be encrypted. So again, just a tremendous amount of power and flexibility in this thing. So I'll go ahead and cancel that. So that kind of gives you an overview, and you can do that to either location, both locations. I mean, you have total control over how this thing goes together. So I hope that gives you a better clue of how this thing works, and just the extreme amount of power that it goes into this thing. So let's talk a little bit about how to make the most use of this thing. Now, if you've scheduled each and every job and you've created a task for each and every job, you're fine. I mean, you can set that schedule up the way you want. When you customize the task scheduler, for example, let's go ahead and do that. Let's go back and take a look at the properties of this job and say, let's go to automatic scheduling, and let's say I'm going to use the Windows Task Scheduler. Okay, so it's launched the Windows Task Scheduler and it's created a default task. However, what I need is, when do I want it to run? When do I want it to trigger? And there's nothing defined at this point. So if I go here and I'm going to go ahead and look at the properties of this, the one thing I want to take a look at is setting up a trigger. So when do I want this to run? So I can actually define a schedule for this particular job. I'm going to say I want it to run daily at whatever time you want, and it's going to run every day, and there's no expiration date. So I'm just going to go ahead and click go, click OK, and now this has been set up to run at 12:07 every day. Great. That's awesome for that particular task. I'm done. If I want to do it that way. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this for now. However, if I want to run all of these jobs, I don't really want to go through tab by tab by tab and set these configurations. And I don't want to go through endless configurations every time I create a new sync job. So what I typically do is I don't set any properties on this. So if you look at the jobs that I've got set up under automatic synchronization rules, let me take this off here because that's what we did. But if we look at any of these jobs here, you'll see that under automatic synchronization, I don't have anything checked off. Now, why is that? Because I've got another way that I can do this that's more powerful for me. And again, this is totally up to you. You can do it this way. You can go, job by job. You can do whatever you want to do. It just depends on what you're doing. And again, this is for pre-scheduled synchronization. It's not for the other things like when the files are changed or when your device is deleted. These are all other options you can do. I'm talking about the way that I run it, which is to run all of my jobs at a specific time all the time. And that's kind of what I like to do. And I'm going to show you how I did that. Okay, so if you look at the Windows Scheduler, I'm going to walk through the one I've already done here. And you notice it says here, always sync, ready to run, runs at 1 a.m. every Tuesday, Thursday of the week. And it started back in July. And my next run date is 10/22, which is in 2 days. So how did I do that, and why do I want to do it this way? So if we look at the individual, I'm going to go ahead and pull the properties up on this. And if we look at the particular specifics on this, what happens is, what I have done is actually trigger this weekly. So I've got a trigger that says run this every Tuesday and Thursday on a weekly basis. So I've picked the increments that I want to do the synchronization in. And then the action. This is where it differs a little bit from the norm. So what I've done here is create an action that will start a program, execute the Always Sync app, and then I've added some arguments to it. And those arguments mean, so the -s is basically telling the program that it's more than one job. It's one or more jobs. And if you don't specify anything, it's going to synchronize all, meaning every single tab that I have set up on here is all going to run. Typically it runs at the same time. So then I've also got a -e after it. And the -e means basically that when you're done synchronizing, exit. Just exit the program. I don't need it to run all the time. I just need it to run, synchronize all my files, and then stop. And then the -m is to minimize. So basically it's telling the program that, when you're running, don't stick it in my face, just run it in the background, kind of minimized, so I don't really have to see it. So if you happen to be on your computer or device at the time that you've run this, it's not going to take over your display. It's just going to run nice and quietly in the background and just synchronize all of your files. And that's all it does. So I'm going to hit cancel. So you can see here that I've set up all of the other parameters for a typical task to run. And this thing is set up to run twice a week. So basically what it does is the Windows scheduler launches always sync with the parameters that I've set, synchronizes all the jobs, and then exits. So I do this in the middle of the night usually, but you can do it whenever you want to. And it's extremely powerful to set it up this way. And again, this is separate from the options they give you within the program. This is just the way that I do it. And for me, it works better not to have to try and figure out a schedule for each particular sync job. I would prefer to just do this and get them all done at once and then go. And again, the interval, the settings, all of that is up to you. So that's all I did here, is to basically create a standard run-of-the-mill Windows task scheduler and define always sync as the program to run with the arguments. It's important that you put the -s, the E, and the M after it if you want it to behave kind of like mine does, and which is basically invisible and runs everything. So I can create, which I've had as many as 20 different sync jobs running at any given time. It makes it really powerful to go ahead and just execute them all and be done with it. And this is, again, if you aren't setting specifics on your folders. For example, let's go back to the, run all works regardless. But things like this, for example, where I'm going to set it to go to whenever file changes are detected, that's going to overwrite my schedule. So if I pick this, it's still going to pick up on every time a file is changed, but then because I've got a run all selection on my program, it's still going to run when the scheduler runs. One kind of complements the other. So I'll still get the functionality of running it when files are detected, but it's still going to run when the scheduler runs. Okay, that's pretty much an overview of the program. There's just a lot of little things all over the place that you kind of need to experiment for yourself. And again, this thing is probably not the prettiest application in the world. It's sort of dated in many ways, but it just works. It works really well, and as I mentioned, I've been using it for many, many years. It has saved me on more than one occurrence, and for me, it's an integral part of my backup strategy. One of the things I wanted to draw your attention to one last time before we leave is, if you notice on most of my not the test jobs we just set up, but on most of my what I'll call production jobs, I always have only a one-way sync. And if you look at my options, I typically delete or uncheck the propagate deletions. In other words, my backup storage location, or my location that I'm syncing to, always has all the files. It doesn't automatically delete from there. For me, that's important, because part of what I use this for is, if stuff gets accidentally deleted, I can go to my alternate location and redraw those files right away. It's important that you understand how you're setting this configuration. So I encourage you to experiment with this quite a bit, on this change option, and decide exactly how you want to use this. If you're just duplicating data for failure, typically the default of bidirectional with both check marks works fine, knowing that if I delete in one location, it's automatically deleted in the other location. All I want is the redundancy, and that's fine. That's a lot of times that's sufficient. But in my case, since I'm actually moving this to, for reasons of protecting the data, I don't want anything deleted, so I've disabled the propagation of deletion. Anyway, I hope that helps. I want to quickly, before we conclude here, just did want to mention two things. One, this program has a 30-day free trial. It isn't free after the 30 days, but it's basically a one-time $25.95 lifetime upgrades. It's basically, there's no subscription. You just buy it outright, end of story. I encourage you to run the free version first, even if it's restricted in a 30-day restriction. Get the feel for it. I think you'll find that when you get it finally working the way you want, that it just becomes totally invaluable. There are very few programs that do everything this does. It's been kind of a platform for quite some time for me anyway. And again, I'm only looking at this from my perspective. If you go back to blog posts that I've written many, many years ago and podcasts that I used to run, if you go to all those, you'll find that I'm always talking about Always Sync. It's been, I've been a big fan, for quite some time. And again, they're not paying me for this. There's no sponsorship, affiliation, or anything like that. This is just my own personal feelings. So I encourage you to try the 30-day period, 30-day free trial, and then I'm sure you're going to find that you're going to like it. And it's a small fee to pay for this kind of safety, security, and power. Anyway,